Hey, welcome to our channel, Ancient to Modern, where we take some of the scripture that was made so long ago and maybe bring it to life and tell you what it's all about today. So we're glad you're with us this week. This week we move on to the Gospel of Luke. Luke was written about the exact same time that Matthew was. We can talk about the late 70s AD, maybe around 80. And even though it was written at the same time, it's a completely different book than Matthew. If you read Matthew, we're going to see a lot of stuff about Jewish customs and the Pharisees and Jewish laws, and all those things are relatively absent in the Gospel of Luke. Whereas Matthew was the Gospel for the Jews, Luke is the Gospel for the Gentiles, written by a Gentile. We're pretty certain Luke is the only Gospel we know who wrote. We don't know that Matthew wrote Matthew. We don't know that Mark wrote Mark or that John wrote John. But we're pretty certain that Luke wrote Luke. Whoever wrote Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 16, verses 9 and 10, Acts changes from a third person description. Paul and his companions, they went here and they went there, and then they did this thing. And all of a sudden, it shifts to first person. Then we traveled. And what happened was Luke joined Paul in Troas. And so we know whoever wrote Luke and Acts started with Paul right then in Acts chapter 16. So we know that Luke wrote Luke. Luke is also the gospel where we see women emphasized. We see the poor emphasized. We see the common person celebrated. And that happens at a lot of different levels. In Luke, it's not the religious people that are the heroes that really get what's going on. It's the outsiders. It's the sinful woman. It's the person with the issue of blood. It's the Zacchaeus. All the people who are formerly on the outside are now on the inside in Luke. The gospel is open to everyone. And so we'll also see a few other things in Luke. Luke is the only gospel that tells a lot about the stories of what happened after Jesus rose from the dead, which we'll hear a little bit about toward the end. But I thought just to kind of get us into Luke, I'll tell two stories from Luke, but really bring out some of the details that we tend to not worry too much about. The first one is in Luke chapter 7, where it says there was this prominent role of what's called the sinful woman. Jesus was invited to a dinner at a Pharisee's house. And his name was Simon, and Jesus seemed to be the guest of honor, or at least maybe expected to be the guest of honor. Jesus shows up, and this is a dinner. And Jesus is the invited guest. So let me tell you a little bit about the dinner in Palestine of the first century. This is a time before books, before newspapers, before the radio. And so a form of entertainment was people would go to these dinners, to these community events, which they were. And while they might not have been invited to the dinner, they could stand around the background and listen to the conversation. That was entertainment. And the more people you had show up for your dinner meant that brought honor to your family. You were seen as important. You were seen as vital. So not only is Jesus at the dinner, he's sitting around the table, but you have other people from the community who are there, standing in the shadows, just listening. They're not invited guests. They're not supposed to talk. They're not supposed to insert themselves into the conversation or into the dinner at all. So Jesus is there, and then we see these strange words in Luke chapter 7. There's a woman that says, standing at Jesus' feet. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me. How on earth can you stand at someone's feet? I could see standing beside someone, in front of someone, behind someone, but standing at Jesus' feet, it doesn't seem to make much sense. How do you do that and not insert yourself into the middle of the dinner? Well, we're all 21st century. Most of us are from the States. And we know at dinner we sit at chairs, we push ourselves up the table, the plates in front of us, and we eat. But that's not how you ate in the Greco-Roman period. an important dinner, you would recline at the table. You would prop yourself up on an elbow maybe, and your feet would be laid out beside you, and you would eat with the one hand. And so if you were reclined at the table, someone could literally stand at your feet. And then as the story goes on, there's a couple other things that happen. The woman begins to weep, and as she cries, her tears hit Jesus' feet. She takes her hair and she dries off Jesus' feet. Now, there's a whole bunch of improper things the woman just did. Let's list them all. First thing that she did, first social faux pas was this. She came out from the background and inserted herself into the dinner by standing at Jesus' feet. That was the first rude, improper thing that she did. Here's the second one she did. Her tears touched Jesus, and then she touched him. In the first century, a woman just didn't go up and just touch a man. Wouldn't have greeted him with a hug, would not have done any of that. That would have been seen as forward and would be seen as a woman of low character. But the third one was even worse. She let down her hair. In that culture, a woman did not let down her hair unless she was within the confines of her home. To go around with unbound, loosened hair in public was another sign of being someone with low morals. And so here's a woman that stepped out, touched Jesus, and let down her hair. That's why she's described as a sinful woman. If you go through the story, Simon says, Jesus, if you're really a prophet, if you're any person at all that we can trust, you would know what kind of woman was touching you. And then Jesus offers her forgiveness and does not condemn her at all. It's a sign into the heart of Jesus, but we don't even see the level that Jesus goes to in his culture, because this woman just did three things that someone from that culture would not be allowed to do. Jesus is even the friend of someone like this. Again, the person, it's not the religious people that get it. It's not Simon. The Pharisee who invited Jesus to dinner that gets it. It's this woman of low reputation. Let's talk about Zacchaeus just for a second. If I asked you, tell me something about Zacchaeus, probably most of you would say, well, he's a wee little man. And then if I said what else, you'd say, a wee little man was he. It's a song we all learned in Sunday school or vacation Bible school or when we were younger. But let's look at the story. Zacchaeus, Jesus is in a town, and if I ask you what town this story took place in, most people don't know. And if you look, it was Jericho. And if I ask you, tell me something about Jericho, you would say, well, the walls come tumbling down. Well, that was Old Testament Jericho. New Testament Jericho was built about a half mile or so away from Old Testament Jericho. Small town, maybe 1,500 people. And it was at a crossroads between the road that followed the Jordan River and the road that came across the desert and then crossed the Jordan and would ascend up into Jerusalem. Jesus is in Jericho. And so Jericho is this very small crossroads town. There's two things that happened there. The first thing is it was a place where dates and figs and certain spices were grown, probably because it was next to the Jordan River. They could probably irrigate the crops. The second thing, well, Rome charged a toll sometimes for using these roads, and so taxes were were taken there and were a place of employment in collecting those taxes. There's something else that happened in Jericho. I wish I had a big picture. King Herod the Great, who was alive when Jesus was born, built his winter palace in Jericho. Jericho would have the same climate as Los Angeles. Dry most of the time. And in December, January, February, and March would be when that area received most of its rain, like Southern California does. So if you were up in Jerusalem, which was at 2,600 feet high or so, sometimes the winter, February and March, could be a little damp, a little chilly. It snows occasionally. It could be in the 40s and 50s. But down in Jericho, that's well below sea level, probably 900 feet below sea level. Think Palm Springs, California. Most of that rain, most of that moisture got wringed out at the top of the ridge where Jericho was. And so if it was 50 and maybe damp in Jerusalem, it would be 75 or 80 in Jericho, just like Palm Springs. And so that's where he built his winter palace. It was fantastic. It had a little shrine to greet dignitaries. It had sunken gardens with shaded porches on both ends so you could stay in the shade and watch the plants and stuff grow. It had a walkway over a little seasonal stream. And on the other side of that stream was the main palace. There was a huge residence with lots of different rooms. But this palace had 3 pools inside, indoor pools in the first century. It had a hot pool, a cold pool, and a lukewarm pool. Think about that. Just for Herod's family. By this time, Herod Antipas is now in control of this area. And in the winter, he had use of that palace. So here's my next question. We know this story took place in Jericho, but when did it take place? Well, you got to do some digging. A couple chapters earlier, we read that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem for the Passover. Passover week is usually linked with Easter. It's in late March. It's in early April. So if Jesus is on his way, we're talking, this story is taking place late February to mid-March, somewhere in there. Well, that's the time of year Herod Antipas would be in Jericho. And if I ask you who Zacchaeus was, most people say he's a tax collector. That's not his role at all. Read the story in Luke chapter 19. He's the chief tax collector. Who's he the chief tax collector for? Well, probably the person who's in Jericho at the time. That's Herod. And let's ask one more question. Who is Herod? Well, Herod's dad was the one that after Jesus was born issued a decree to kill all the male children in Bethlehem because he didn't want any rivals. So Zacchaeus is the right-hand man, the chief representative of the family who tried to kill Jesus when he was a baby. And so when Jesus hits Jericho, who does he go to? Who does he engage? Zacchaeus. Not just a short guy, not just a tax collector, but the guy who represents the family that tried to kill Jesus as a boy. Zacchaeus is not a story. It's never been a story about a short guy who climbed a tree. It's a story about Jesus going to the least likely person in Jericho, the one person he had most reason to condemn, distrust, and distance himself from. But he went to that person anyway. It's a story about radical grace of those who least deserve it. And Zacchaeus gets it, where the other people do not. That's what Luke's about. And this week's about resurrection. And I can't let an Easter week go by without talking to you about the resurrection. The resurrection asks you to believe a ridiculous claim. Jesus died and rose again. That is not scientific. It's not modern. And it is a reason that some people kind of ridicule us. We believe a ridiculous story. And I agree. It's utterly ridiculous. Why would anyone believe in the resurrection? Well, in the first century, you literally had people who were claiming to be the Messiah coming along every year. And yet the people that saw Jesus said that he was the Messiah. He was not a military ruler. He was not a political leader. He did nothing great that would attract people to him at all. As far as Messiahs go, Jesus was terrible. He was a flop. He gave no reason to believe. And yet these people did. And when they had chance after chance to follow far more successful, visible messiahs, they didn't. What on earth would make people change? What on earth would make people who, even when threatened with their own life, say, no, I'm going to follow this discredited, crucified leader called Jesus? They had to see something so amazing that they refused to back off that claim. Even when the leaders say, if you don't stop saying Jesus is alive, we're going to kill you. And there was a far more successful Messiah right over there. because they could not deny what they had seen. They could not deny what they had heard. And a few generations later, the power of this story literally overturned the Roman Empire. The power of that story was a key role in overturning an earthly empire called communism not too long ago. It's a powerful story that Jesus is alive. And it's more than a historical fact. It's something that changes people's lives today. It is a living presence in our lives. Not just a thing to believe, not just a creed to check off, but something that continues to impact our world today. We'd love to have you come and discover and hear about this not only crucified Jesus, but a risen Jesus as well. So this Easter, whether it's here or someplace in your local community, I encourage you to come hear our story, the story that's changed human history. Come hear about this crucified Jesus. Hey, welcome. Glad you joined us on our channel. We want you to like us, subscribe to us, leave a comment below, ask us a question. We want you to interact. We want this to be about you answering your questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. I want to hear from you, and I'll see you again in a week or so. Have a wonderful Easter.